Daniel Matthews stared at his computer screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words of his family lawyer still echoed in his mind. Your grandmother's will is clear. You must be married by your 33rd birthday to receive the inheritance. At 32, with only 3 months left and his tech company bleeding money, he was desperate. He took a deep breath and typed the final words of his anonymous ad, seeking temporary wife. 1-year contract, $500,000 payment upon completion, discretion required. He clicked post before he could change his mind. Across town, Rose Taylor wiped paint from her hands and checked her phone. Another rejection email from a gallery. She sighed and looked at the stack of bills on her small apartment table. Student loans, rent, and worst of all, her mother's medical expenses. The part-time jobs weren't enough anymore. She opened a job listings website, scrolling without much hope until the unusual ad caught her eye. This has to be a joke, she muttered, but copied the contact information anyway. 3 days later, they met at a quiet corner table in an upscale coffee shop. Daniel wore an expensive suit that matched his cool, businesslike demeanor. Rose had dressed in her nicest blouse, trying to look professional despite her racing heart. So you're serious about this? Rose asked, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug to hide their trembling. Completely. Daniel's voice was even, as if they were discussing a normal business deal. My grandmother was old-fashioned. The inheritance terms require marriage. My company needs that money. Rose studied his face, handsome in a stern way, with dark eyes that revealed nothing. And what exactly would this arrangement involve? Daniel slid a folder across the table. Everything is outlined here. We marry, you move into my penthouse, separate bedrooms, of course. We appear as a couple at necessary events. After 1 year, we divorce quietly, and you receive the payment. Rose flipped through the pages, her artist's eyes noticing how meticulously organized everything was. Physical relationship? None, Daniel said firmly. This is strictly business. The amount on the final page made her breath catch. It would pay off her mother's medical bills and her student loans, with enough left to finally pursue her art full-time. Why me? She asked. You could have chosen anyone. Something flickered across Daniel's face, the first real emotion he'd shown. You were honest in your email. You didn't pretend to be excited about marrying a stranger. I need someone practical. Their fingers brushed as Rose handed back the folder, and an unexpected warmth passed between them. She quickly pulled her hand away. I need time to think about this, she said. Daniel nodded. You have 2 days. He stood, placing his business card on the table. My private number. Don't share it. After he left, Rose sat alone, turning the card over in her fingers. The coffee shop buzzed around her, but she felt isolated in her decision. This was crazy. Marrying a stranger for money, yet the image of her mother in the hospital bed, worrying about bills even through her pain, strengthened her resolve. That night, Rose couldn't sleep. She painted until dawn, creating a dark canvas with swirls of gold breaking through. Chaos and opportunity. When the morning light streamed through her apartment windows, she picked up her phone. Daniel answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. I'll do it, Rose said, her voice steadier than she felt. But I want to add some terms of my own. There was a pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle that surprised her. I should have known you'd negotiate. Let's meet for lunch. As she hung up, Rose wondered what she'd just agreed to. 1 year of her life for financial freedom. 1 year pretending to love a man she barely knew. 1 year that would change everything. 1 week later, Rose stood beside Daniel in the small courthouse, exchanging vows with a stranger. She wore a simple white dress she'd found on sale, while he wore another immaculate suit. His assistant Tom, the only witness to their ceremony, knew the truth and watched with poorly hidden amusement. The gold band felt heavy on Rose's finger as they signed the marriage certificate. Daniel's signature was bold and confident next to her hesitant scrawl. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Matthews, the clerk said with a smile. Daniel drove them back to his penthouse in silence, the city skyline growing closer through the windshield. When they arrived, Rose stood in the vast living room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, and stunning view. Your room is this way, Daniel said, leading her down a hallway. He opened a door to reveal a spacious bedroom with its own bathroom. I thought you might want to decorate it yourself. Rose set down her small suitcase. Thank you. That's thoughtful. My room is at the other end of the hallway. Kitchen's fully stocked. I usually work late. He handed her a credit card and a key. For expenses, and well, it's your home now too. That night, Rose lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the faint sounds of Daniel working in his home office. She'd never felt more alone. The next morning, a knock at her door woke her. Daniel stood there, already dressed for work, holding a cup of coffee. Family dinner tonight, he said, offering her the mug. My parents and sister want to meet you. Rose took the coffee, their fingers briefly touching. You didn't mention family dinners in the contract. A hint of a smile crossed Daniel's face. There's a clause about appearing as a couple at necessary events. This qualifies. The Matthews family lived in a mansion in the suburbs. Daniel's father, Robert, shook Rose's hand firmly, his eyes appraising her value like one of his business acquisitions. His mother, Patricia, air-kissed her cheeks, and immediately commented on Rose's quaint dress. His sister Jane was the only one who offered a genuine smile. So how did you two meet? Patricia asked over dinner, swirling expensive wine in her glass. Daniel looked at Rose, a silent challenge in his eyes. They hadn't prepared for this question. At art gallery, Rose said smoothly. Daniel was the only one who asked questions about my favorite painting instead of trying to impress me with how much he knew about art. Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, but he played along. She told me I had terrible taste, but she'd help educate me. Rose laughed, the sound surprisingly natural. Your son does need help. He had a stock market graph hanging in his living room. It was an abstract piece, Daniel protested, the corner of his mouth lifting. The family chuckled, and Rose felt Daniel's hand find hers under the table, a silent thank you that sent warmth up her arm. Later that night, as they drove home, Daniel said, You were good tonight. They liked you. Even though I'm clearly not from your world. Daniel parked the car and turned to look at her. Maybe that's why they liked you. Days turned into weeks. Rose set up a small studio in the spare room, paint soon speckling the pristine floors despite her careful tarps. Daniel found himself stopping at the doorway, watching her work, fascinated by the intensity in her eyes as she created. They developed an unexpected rhythm, coffee in the mornings, occasional shared dinners when he wasn't working late. Daniel teaching Rose about wine, Rose showing him how to see the stories in paintings. One night, Daniel came home to find Rose asleep on the couch, a book fallen on her chest, her hair spread across the cushion. He stood watching her for longer than he should have, noticing the peaceful curve of her lips, the delicate arch of her eyebrows. Carefully, he placed a blanket over her. As he did, she stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep, her hand catching his. The touch lingered as he gently pulled away. In his own room, Daniel loosened his tie and looked at the calendar. 11 more months of this arrangement. For the first time, he wondered if that would be enough. 3 months into their arrangement, Daniel and Rose attended a crucial business gala. Daniel's company was launching a new app, and potential investors filled the elegant hotel ballroom. Rose wore a burgundy dress that Daniel had bought her, the silky fabric making her feel both beautiful and like an imposter. You look stunning, Daniel whispered as they entered, his hand resting on the small of her back. His touch felt different lately, lingering, warmer. Just playing my part, Rose replied, though her heart beat faster at his words. Daniel introduced her to business associates, his voice filled with a pride that sounded genuine. Rose was surprised to find she understood much of the tech talk from overhearing Daniel's work calls at home. What do you think of the interface design? An investor asked Daniel, showing him the app prototype on a tablet. Before Daniel could answer, Rose pointed to the screen. The menu navigation is too cluttered. People will get frustrated tapping the wrong option with those small icons. The room went quiet. Daniel stared at her, his expression unreadable. She's right, he finally said. Rose has an artist's eye for design. We should adjust it. The investor nodded, impressed. Later, as they shared a dance, Daniel held her closer than necessary for their pretend relationship. You didn't tell me you were paying attention to my work, he said, his breath warm against her ear. You didn't ask. Rose smiled up at him. I live with you. I listen. Something changed that night. Daniel began asking for her opinion on projects. Rose found herself enjoying the challenge, sketching alternative designs that he would study with serious attention. One evening, they sat on the living room floor surrounded by takeout containers and design mock-ups, working late into the night. When Rose pointed out a flaw in the color scheme, Daniel laughed and leaned over to grab her sketchpad, his face suddenly close to hers. For a moment, neither moved. Rose could feel his breath on her lips, see the question in his eyes. The doorbell broke the moment. Daniel pulled back, clearing his throat. Must be the additional food I ordered. But it wasn't food. A tall, elegantly dressed woman stood in the doorway, her perfectly made-up face twisted in surprise. Daniel, she purred, leaning in to kiss his cheek. I was in town and thought I'd surprise you. Lisa, Daniel said stiffly. This is Rose. My wife. Lisa's perfectly arched eyebrows shot up. Wife? Since when do you have a wife? The word hung in the air, a reminder of the fiction they were living. We've been married 3 months, Rose said, stepping forward to take Daniel's hand. The gesture felt natural, protective. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Interesting. Daniel never mentioned you when we spoke last month. Daniel tensed beside her. Rose could feel the arrangement threatening to unravel. That's because he respects my privacy, Rose improvised. I asked him not to tell many people until I was ready. My mother was very sick when we met, and we wanted to keep things quiet. Lisa studied her face, searching for deception. How did you meet again? At the Modern Art Museum, Rose said without hesitation. Daniel was standing in front of my favorite Rothko painting, looking completely confused. Daniel's thumb stroked the back of her hand, encouraging her to continue. He asked me why anyone would pay millions for colored rectangles, Rose continued, smiling at the memory she was creating. I told him he needed to feel the painting, not just see it. We ended up talking for hours. When he finally asked for my number, I gave him my coffee shop punch card instead. He had to come find me. Daniel laughed, the sound so natural it startled her. You made me work for it. Lisa watched their intertwined fingers, the easy way they stood together. Whatever she'd come for, she seemed to think better of it. Well, how? Charming, she said flatly. I should go. After she left, Daniel exhaled heavily. That was close. She's an ex who's been trying to reconnect. You were brilliant. Rose realized they were still holding hands and gently pulled away. Just doing what you're paying me for. But as she turned to go to her room, Daniel caught her arm. Rose, He stopped, seeming unsure for the first time since she'd met him. Thank you. That night, Rose lay awake thinking about the almost kiss, about the warm pressure of Daniel's hand in hers, and about how easily the false story of their meeting had flowed from her lips. The line between pretending and feeling was beginning to blur, and she wasn't sure if that terrified or thrilled her. 5 months into their marriage, Daniel paced the penthouse living room, phone pressed to his ear. Rose watched him from the kitchen doorway, a mug of tea warming her hands. His face was tense, brow furrowed as he spoke with his business partner. I need to go to Tokyo, he said after hanging up. There's a problem with our overseas launch. I'll be gone for 3 weeks. Rose nodded, surprised by the twinge of disappointment she felt. I'll be fine here. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, hesitating. Actually, I was thinking you might come with me. To Tokyo? Rose set her mug down. Why? We're meeting with investors who've met you at events. They'll expect my wife to be there. He paused. And your design input has been valuable. The real reason hung unspoken between them. They'd grown comfortable in each other's presence, their pretend relationship developing edges of something genuine neither was ready to name. 2 days later, they boarded a first-class flight to Tokyo. Rose had never flown first class before, and Daniel smiled at her wide-eyed excitement as she explored all the seat features. Try the champagne, he suggested, his eyes lingering on her lips as she sipped. In Tokyo, their hotel suite had separate bedrooms, but a shared living space. The city lights twinkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting patterns across the plush carpet. During meetings, Rose found herself genuinely involved, offering insights on the app design that impressed the Japanese investors. She watched Daniel in his element, confident, brilliant, occasionally glancing at her for support. Each look felt like a secret conversation. In the evenings, they explored the city together. Daniel knew some Japanese and guided her through crowded markets and peaceful gardens. In Shinjuku, he bought her a delicate silver bracelet from a tiny shop when he caught her admiring it. "For making this trip a success," he said as he fastened it on her wrist, his fingers lingering on her pulse point. After a particularly successful meeting, they celebrated at a high-end izakaya. The sake flowed freely, warming Rose's cheeks and loosening the careful restraint they both maintained. Daniel told stories from his college days that made her laugh, and she shared dreams of the art she wanted to create. "I've never talked to anyone like this," Daniel admitted, his voice husky in the dim restaurant. Not even what?" Rose asked, leaning closer. "Not even people I've actually dated," he finished, looking slightly embarrassed. "Isn't that strange?" Walking back to their hotel, they got caught in a sudden downpour. They ran the last block, arriving in the lobby drenched and laughing. Rose's thin blouse clung to her skin, and she caught Daniel's eyes dropping to the curve of her waist before he quickly looked away. In the elevator, they stood closer than necessary, the silence charged with unspoken tension. When Rose shivered, Daniel removed his wet jacket and draped it over her shoulders, his hands staying on her arms a moment too long. Back in their suite, Rose stepped onto the balcony to watch the rain over the glittering city. Daniel joined her, offering a towel for her wet hair. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured. "Yes," he replied, but he wasn't looking at the view. Rose turned to find him watching her, his eyes dark with an intensity that made her breath catch. The careful distance they'd maintained seemed to dissolve in the humid night air. "Daniel," she whispered, unsure what she was asking for. He moved closer, one hand gently brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "This wasn't in the contract," he said softly. "I know." His lips met hers tentatively at first, then with growing hunger as she responded. The kiss deepened, his arms encircling her waist, pulling her against him. Rose's hands slid up his chest to his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him through his damp shirt. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings about complications, about money and contracts and the temporary nature of their arrangement. But as Daniel's lips moved to her neck, leaving a trail of fire on her skin, Rose found she didn't care. They stumbled back into the suite, still wrapped in each other. Daniel paused, his forehead resting against hers, breathing hard. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with desire but his eyes searching hers for consent. Rose answered by pulling him down for another kiss, knowing they were crossing a line that would change everything. Morning light filtered through the curtains, waking Rose. For a moment, she was disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of an arm around her waist, the warmth of another body against her back. Then memories of the night before rushed back, Daniel's kisses, his gentle touch, the way he'd whispered her name. She carefully turned to find him watching her, his expression unreadable in the soft light. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," she replied, suddenly shy. "About last night?" Daniel traced her cheek with his fingertips. "Do you regret it?" "No," Rose answered honestly, "but it complicates things." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "We should talk about it. But not right now." He pressed a soft kiss to her forehead and slipped out of bed. "I have a morning meeting. Join me for lunch after." Throughout the day, Rose's mind replayed every moment from the night before. The passion had been unexpected, but what surprised her more was the tenderness, the way Daniel had held her afterward as if she were precious. When they returned to New York a week later, things had shifted between them. They still maintained separate bedrooms for appearances, but Daniel often found his way to her room at night or she to his. They never discussed what it meant for their arrangement, both afraid to break the spell. One morning, Rose's phone rang as Daniel made coffee. She frowned at the unknown number. "Hello. Mrs. Matthews? This is Memorial Hospital. Your mother has been admitted with respiratory distress." Rose's face drained of color as she listened. When she hung up, she was shaking. "My mother collapsed. She's in the hospital." Her voice broke. "I need to go to her." Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his keys. "I'll drive you." At the hospital, Rose rushed to her mother's room. The small, frail woman in the bed looked worse than Rose had seen her. Daniel hung back at the doorway, giving them space. "You must be Rose's husband," her mother said weakly, noticing him. "She's told me about you in her calls." Daniel stepped forward, taking the older woman's hand with surprising gentleness. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Taylor. I just wish it were under better circumstances." Rose watched him, wondering what version of their relationship her mother had pieced together from their conversations. She hadn't told her mother about the arrangement, only that she had married and was happy. The doctor arrived, explaining that her mother's condition had worsened and would require more intensive treatment. "The specialized care isn't covered by her insurance," he said apologetically. Rose's heart sank. The money Daniel had promised her would cover it, but she wouldn't receive that until their year was complete, still months away. "Money isn't an issue," Daniel said firmly, surprising Rose. "Make sure she gets the best care available." Later, in the hospital cafeteria, Rose confronted him. "You don't have to do this. It wasn't part of our deal." Daniel took her hand across the table. "I want to help." "Why?" she pressed. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I care about you, Rose. More than I should." The words hung between them, dangerous and thrilling. 2 weeks later, Rose's mother was stable and recovering at home with a private nurse Daniel had arranged. Rose dove into repainting with new intensity, processing her complicated feelings through her art. One afternoon, Daniel's assistant Tom stopped by the penthouse to drop off documents. Rose offered him coffee while he waited for Daniel to return from a meeting. "He's different since meeting you," Tom commented, watching her over the rim of his mug. "Different how?" "Happier, more human." Tom tilted his head. "I've known Daniel for years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Rose felt her cheeks warm. "It's just the arrangement." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Is that what you both tell yourselves?" After he left, Rose called her friend Maggie, needing to confide in someone about her confusion. "I'm falling for him, Mags," she admitted, pacing the living room. "But in 7 months this all ends. He pays me, and we go our separate ways." She sighed. "I can't wait for this year to be over. This limbo is torture." She didn't notice Daniel standing in the doorway, keys in hand, his face darkening at her words before he silently turned and left. The next 2 weeks were painfully quiet in the penthouse. Daniel left early each morning and returned late, sometimes not at all. When he was home, he was polite but distant, his eyes no longer seeking Rose's across the room. The warmth that had grown between them frosted over with each passing day. Rose tried to understand what had changed. She replayed their last conversations, searching for clues. Had the reality of their arrangement finally caught up with him? Was he regretting their intimacy? The questions kept her awake at night, staring at her bedroom ceiling, listening for his footsteps that rarely came. One evening, Rose was painting in the spare room when she heard the front door open. She waited, brush in hand, for Daniel to pass by as he usually did. Instead, he appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. "About the contract." Rose set down her brush, heart pounding. "What about it?" "I've been thinking," Daniel said, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "Maybe we should end it early." The words hit Rose like a physical blow. "End it? Why?" "This arrangement has become complicated. I think it would be best if we moved on." His face was a careful mask, the businessman she'd first met returning. "Of course, I'll pay you the full amount we agreed upon." Rose stood slowly, anger and hurt rising in her chest. "So that's it? You've decided you're done playing house?" A flash of something, pain, crossed his face before disappearing. "This was always temporary, Rose. We both knew that." "Did we?" She stepped closer to him. "What about Tokyo? What about everything since?" "A mistake." The word fell between them like a stone. "We got caught up in the pretense." Rose searched his face, looking for the man who had held her so tenderly, who had sat by her mother's hospital bed, who had laughed with her over takeout on the living room floor. He wasn't there. "I don't believe you," she whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened. "The money will be in your account tomorrow. You can stay until you find a new place." Before she could respond, he turned and left. Rose heard his bedroom door close with a decisive click. She stood frozen, paintbrush dripping blue onto the floor as her world collapsed. The next morning, Rose checked her bank account. Daniel had transferred the full payment, more than enough to pay off her mother's medical bills and her student loans, with plenty left over. The money she had wanted so desperately 6 months ago now felt hollow. She packed her belongings, leaving most of the clothes and jewelry Daniel had bought her. She couldn't bear to take them. As she zipped her suitcase, a knock came at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Daniel. It was his grandmother, Eleanor Matthews, elegant in a cream suit despite her 80 years. Rose had met her only twice at family functions. "Going somewhere?" Eleanor asked, eyeing the suitcase. "I'm leaving," Rose said simply. "Daniel and I. It's over." The older woman settled herself in the armchair by the window. "Sit down, dear. I think we need to talk." Rose sat reluctantly on the edge of the bed. "There's nothing to talk about. My grandson is many things, but he's never been a good liar." Eleanor's shrewd eyes studied Rose's face. "Neither are you, for that matter." Rose felt color rise in her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Eleanor leaned forward. "Daniel didn't fall in love with you according to plan, did he?" Rose's breath caught. "How did you know about your arrangement?" Eleanor smiled. "I've built and run businesses for 50 years, dear. I recognize a transaction when I see one." She paused. "But I also recognize love when I see it." Rose's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for days. "It doesn't matter now. He wants me gone." "Does he?" Eleanor raised a perfectly penciled eyebrow. "Or is he protecting himself from what he thinks is inevitable rejection? Daniel has always believed he's unlovable beyond what his money can buy." "That's not true," Rose said fiercely. "He's brilliant and kind and—" She stopped, realizing she was proving Eleanor's point. "The inheritance clause was my idea," Eleanor admitted, "but not for the reasons he thinks. I wanted him to find someone who would see past his wealth." Her eyes softened. "Someone like you." Rose stood, confusion and hope warring within her. "What should I do?" Eleanor rose gracefully. "That depends. Do you love him?" The question hung in the air as Rose faced the truth she'd been avoiding for months. Rose stood in the empty gallery surrounded by her paintings. After leaving the penthouse 3 weeks ago, she had channeled all her pain and confusion into her art. A small gallery owner had seen her work and offered her this one-night showing. Now her heart and soul hung on the walls for strangers to judge. The central piece was a large canvas depicting 2 silhouettes reaching for each other across a divide, their fingertips almost touching, with golden light spilling between them. Rose had titled it The Arrangement. She checked her phone again. No messages from Daniel. After her conversation with Eleanor, Rose had tried to talk to him, but he'd already left for a business trip. She'd left the money he paid her with his grandmother, along with a letter explaining her feelings. Pride had kept her from calling him since. The gallery doors opened, and people began to filter in. Rose plastered on a smile and made small talk, but her eyes kept drifting to the entrance. Across town, Daniel sat in his office, staring at a contract without seeing it. The penthouse felt impossibly empty without Rose. Her laughter no longer echoed through the rooms, her paintbrushes no longer cluttered the kitchen sink. He'd thrown himself into work, but nothing filled the void she'd left behind. His intercom buzzed. "Your grandmother is here to see you," his assistant announced. Daniel sighed. He'd been avoiding Eleanor since Rose left. "Send her in." Eleanor swept into his office, elegant as always. Without preamble, she placed an envelope on his desk. "You're a fool," she said simply. Daniel recognized Rose's handwriting on the envelope. "What's this?" "She returned the money," Eleanor said. "All of it." Daniel's head snapped up. "Why would she?" "Read the letter." Eleanor turned to leave. "And when you're done, there's an art show in Soho tonight. A promising new artist." She handed him an invitation card. "Don't be late." Alone, Daniel opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Rose's words flowed across the page. "I didn't fall in love with your money, your penthouse, or your name. I fell in love with the man who placed a blanket over me when I fell asleep reading. The man who remembered how I take my coffee. The man who sat by my mother's bedside. I'm returning the money because what grew between us was never part of our arrangement. It was real, at least for me." Daniel read the letter twice, then grabbed his jacket and rushed out. At the gallery, Rose was answering questions about her technique when a murmur went through the crowd. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they found her. The gallery seemed to empty around them as he walked toward her, stopping before a painting of a rainy Tokyo skyline seen from a balcony. In the reflection on the window glass, 2 figures stood close together, about to kiss. "You captured it perfectly," he said softly. It was an important moment, Rose replied, her heart hammering. Daniel turned to her, vulnerability clear in his eyes. I heard what you said to your friend that day. About not being able to wait for the year to be over. Understanding dawned on Rose. You thought I couldn't wait to leave you, weren't you? Rose shook her head. I couldn't wait for the pretending to be over. For us to be real, if that's what you wanted to. Daniel took a step closer. I overheard only part of the conversation and jumped to conclusions. When I thought about losing you, I panicked. I decided to end things before you could. We're quite a pair, Rose said with a sad smile. Both of us afraid of the same thing. Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. I've never needed my grandmother's money. My company turned profitable months ago. Then why continue our arrangement? Because I couldn't bear the thought of you leaving. His voice dropped to a whisper. I love you, Rose. Not as part of an arrangement. Not as my pretend wife. I love you for the way you see the world, for your kindness, for how you challenge me. Tears filled Rose's eyes. I love you too. Then come home, Daniel said, drawing her closer. Not because of a contract or money. Come home because it's where we both belong. Rose looked around at her paintings, each one a piece of their story, from the coffee shop where they first met to the Tokyo hotel room where everything changed. I have a better idea, she said. Let's find a new home. Together. One that's truly ours from the beginning. Daniel's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. No contracts this time. Just one promise, Rose said, rising on her toes to meet his lips. To love each other for real. As they kissed, surrounded by the art that told their story, the gallery erupted in applause. But neither of them noticed, too lost in the moment, that marked not an ending, but a true beginning.